Thank you for having me here. I'm going to be talking today about a conflict at the center of education, which is this tension between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, which is a somewhat different take from that Eric just presented, but I think mostly simpatico with it. So what is our job in institutions of higher ed? It is to discover and create, depending on what fields we're in, knowledge, and to disseminate it to the students who we have. And it's tough because human wisdom expands over time in the long term, but in the short term it ebbs and flows. And so it's hard to tell at any given moment if the changes that we're seeing are actually about progress that will be expansive and good for humanity, or if they are in fact regressive. I think everyone in this room has seen the effects of some of these regressive retractions, but it's actually a challenge. So at the time of the Industrial Revolution, it seems that we had mostly universities of orthodoxy, where in our arrogance we imagined that we knew what there was to know, and that all that needed to be done really was to push that knowledge into the minds of the young. Later, around the turn of the 20th century, by some historical estimations, universities have become places that recognized the shifting and incomplete nature of our knowledge and rewarded changes in perspective as new information emerged. Coincident with that are some of the challenges that Eric has described, right? That as new opinions and new ways of thinking emerged, of course there is going to be dissent. So this though, I'm going to argue, is the university system in which we all came of age in the mid and late 20th century, and it is indeed the university system that we need. That we can't go back to one of orthodoxy, to one that imagines that we know what there is to know and that we just simply need to pass it on to the next generation. We need indeed a liberal arts for the 21st century. Liberal arts has come under a lot of flack for doing exactly what we've been seeing on college campuses lately and what has spread into the greater world, that it has not represented what we are actually capable of as humans. But a liberal arts education allows for the possibility of educational emergence. It is exactly doing what it is that trade schools don't. If you imagine that you already know everything you need to know, then you can go into the profession and get the training that you need, and you're going to have it at the end. But at this moment, things are changing so rapidly that is not the education that people need. What we are seeing is a narrowing of training, a specializing of training for many people, and that's actually exactly the opposite of what we need right now. We needed something more expansive, more potentially forward-thinking, while also respecting of tradition in the 20th century, and certainly now in the 21st, we need it even more. So we need to be educating for breadth and for problem solving. These are some of the students that I and my husband Bret Weinstein had on a study abroad trip in Ecuador in 2016. We were studying evolution and ecology, so obviously we were at a hat factory, right? This is the sort of thing that a generalist education should allow for, to go and see what it is that other people do, how they make things, what it is that they think, and how it is that they came to think those things. So I would argue that this need for nimble thinking and for creativity is what is missing from many college classrooms at this point. That we need to teach people how to pose questions and not just answer them, but to pose good questions and to tell the difference between a good question and a bad question. And certainly, I think most people will agree that in fact there are bad questions. It's not true what they say, right? There are plenty of bad questions, but many of the questions that seem bad at first actually have something interesting to reveal, because the perspective that they come from may be one that you weren't expecting. So we need nimble, creative thinkers who can pose good questions and who can work from first principles rather than from mnemonics and received wisdom. And received wisdom is, of course, what you get in a field that has been stuck for many years. And this is part of the kernel of truth that is at the core of the authoritarian left that is taking over campuses, right? That they have correctly observed, or at least the radicals, the shepherds among them, have correctly observed that there is a problem when fields say, we've got it, we've got this covered, and that's all there is that you need to know, just take it on, just take on the received wisdom. It's not a sufficient answer for people who actually want to be educated. So students like this, students of traditional college age right now, can't accurately predict what their careers will look like when they're 70, or even 50, or even 30, really. And so knowing that, we need to prepare them by providing them breadth and the ability, like I said, to work from first principles. So at this moment when we need perhaps more than ever before to have expansive thinkers who can think outside of every box that they've ever imagined before, we have this rise of the new orthodoxy, or what I will argue is a sort of a pseudo-orthodoxy in the form of grievance studies. You know, the term dubbed by James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, and Helen Pluckrose with their recent project, revealing the rot at the core of many of these, you know, just a few traditional disciplines, but all of these new disciplines that have emerged in the last 10, 20, 30 years that end in studies. That grievance studies spreads from faculty to students. It didn't, for the most part, originate with students, and from there to the rest of the world. And this is causing a problem at the heart of education. Mob rule is threatening to deplatform speakers, to decide who gets to speak, to decide who gets to work where, to decide what ideas get to be heard. And this, you know, there are incidents across the entire Western world at this point. So I'll spend just a little bit of time, as we were asked to, talking about my experience and that of Bret Weinstein, my husband. So at some sites, at some schools, just questioning the move towards what has been called an equity agenda, equity being code word. It doesn't mean equality. Just questioning the move towards an equity agenda is enough to get the full wrath of a college to descend upon you. And in our particular case, this school, this Evergreen was an extraordinary place, a public liberal arts college, which actually had great diversity of socioeconomic class, which is, I think, maybe the most important kind of diversity that never gets talked about by the wokesters, by the woke army. Under the guise of this move towards an equity and inclusion agenda, we had the core principles of the liberal arts college were dismantled. And anyone who questioned either the goals that were being promoted or even just the methods by which they were being promoted were taken to be an enemy of the cause and therefore of the college itself. Just a few images from Evergreen the year that it fell apart. Long before the rest of the world had heard about what was going on, this is months before the public protests in May of 2017, anti-racism protests were occurring. Here we have a group of students protesting with raised Black Power fists, mostly not black students, protesting the initiation of a new building being revealed on campus, which was named in honor of our just passed president, Les Perce, himself a black man. The basis for the protest is the rampant white supremacy on campus. No credible evidence of actual systemic on racism on campus ever emerged, as you might imagine. So just a few other images. Here, you know, a clip from maybe the most famous scene. And again, in the case of all of these, the images, the short video I'm going to show you, were taken by the protesters themselves and uploaded and then grabbed by others who realized very quickly, as really the most of the world, we who see this as authoritarian and regressive are a majority, see what has happened here as authoritarian, as anti-liberal, and yet it is coming under the guise of liberal. So we have students, some of the same ones from these protests months earlier, showing up in Bret Weinstein's classroom and demanding his resignation, his firing. Of course, nothing will appease the mob, so whatever they were demanding, it wasn't going to be sufficient if he acquiesced, which he didn't. Later the same day, groups started convening in the hundreds. This is in the library building, what would become a meeting that verged on violence and literal anarchy several times, in which the police chief had been told to arrive disarmed, and there was only one way out, which was lined with anarchists. Graffiti started showing up on campus, later actual vandalism in which the library and the science buildings were targeted for breakage. I think at no accident. Let's see. a famous picture that again was taken by, staged, choreographed, and taken by the protesters themselves and posted, in which the vigilante mob, the would-be activists, are posing with baseball bats. They don't look very frightening, do they, right? But it is actually true that some members of this group and others who did arm themselves with baseball bats and nightsticks, after the president of the college had told the police force to stand down, that they were not allowed to protect anyone, some of these people did indeed assault other students. And friends and family of ours saw what was happening and said, "You're not safe. Everyone knows where you live. You need to leave." And so we took our children out of state at the heart of this crisis. Meanwhile, the protesters, which I object to that term, the activists really, started doxing Bret's students who were defending him. And they said things like, "I have names and faces of students in Bret's class who were filming the class protest yesterday and who were actively defending him," because that's the danger, right? "If you would like to see these faces for your own safety, please contact me or message me on here." That's called doxing. And students, our students who were staunch in the face of this and who did not back down to the mob were being followed in the forest. One of them had people show up at her home. That is where the actual aggression and close to violence was happening. So President Bridges, who is still the president, almost 2 years later, on the very first day of the protests that went public, had invited, at their instigation, a core group of protesters to a private meeting with himself, all of the VPs of the college, the provost, and all of the deans. So we have a private meeting, 2.5-hour meeting with a core group of protesters and all of the upper admin of the college, which once again, the protesters filmed and uploaded to the internet, so we have it now. And here's just one little clip describing how President Bridges responds to the protesters' request to first target STEM in particular because scientists are particularly racist. And what shall we do about people like Bret who are dissenting from the cause?
They're going to say some things that we don't like, and our job is to bring them around, or get them out.
Right.
And what I hear us stating that we are working toward is bring them in, train them, and if they don't get it, sanction.
Right.
And you must, and I encourage you to hold us accountable to doing that.
Bring them in, train them, and if they don't get it, sanction them. This is the upper admin of a college, the president of a college, telling protesters who by mob rule have taken over the college that this is what he is going to do to faculty who dissent. And he asks for their help in keeping him to his word. So is this a new orthodoxy? Maybe. Although orthodoxy, the honorable and valuable kind of orthodoxy, takes time to emerge, right? This feels a lot more like authoritarianism, just plain and simple. It is a kind of pseudo-orthodoxy for sure. It's becoming the law of the land on college campuses, but it's brute force and it's trying to ascend too quickly. And that, I think, should give us hope, actually, that it can't probably stick, but it's sure looking like it's going to make a go for it. So colleges should be safe spaces. Hold on. For ideas, not for feelings, right? This is what we are. Institutions of higher ed are about ideas, about the interchange of ideas. We are keepers of both tradition, yes, but also progress. Protectors of paradigms and anomalies, and overseers of both orthodoxy and heresy. So in that, you see a tension. How is it that we can do both without conflict? We can't. There will be conflict. Of course there will be conflict. And I think there was a difference, although many of the earlier protests from the 60s and such sounded similar in some ways. These protests now feel different, I think. That this is trying to eradicate everything that came before and not regarding either the legitimate part of the orthodoxy, the tradition that has made sense, to stand, nor to leave open voices that dissent from what is happening now. So I want to put in just a couple of words for the actual legitimate both claims of the left, which I am a part of, and guard against, warn against attributing all of this nonsense that is emerging from the authoritarian left right now to the actual liberals who still do exist. The authoritarian left, as we all know, have some very wrong-headed claims. None of these things are true. Men and women are not the same. Obesity does pose health risks. Asking for evidence of racism is not, in fact, evidence of racism. And sharing and borrowing cross-culturally is not inherently appropriative. It's what humans do. That's what culture is. And so it's not inherently harmful to the founding culture. Sometimes, sure, but no, not always. So the Chinese prom dress, among other things, are great examples of how absurd this binary state of affairs, this binary kind of thinking can lead us. So unfortunately, this threatens to obscure the legitimate and true claims, concerns of the rest of us on the left about wealth inequality, about the fate of the environment, about healthcare, especially in the United States, and more. And it also threatens to obscure the fact that the increases in compassion and tolerance over the last 100 years, civil rights, women's rights, workers' rights, children's rights, these are legitimately credited to the left, but not this one, not this new authoritarian left. And they are risking confusing the history and a whole lot of other people about where credit actually should go. So all of that is true, and it is alarming, and it is what has brought us here together, but I'm going to argue that there's something else going on too. There's another older move afoot that is more powerful yet, actually, and it doesn't tend to share the same conversational space as the one about the woke army and the intersectional left. But in universities anyway, it shares space, and it is part of what is instructive, is part of what is creating the capacity for the activists to do what they're doing. The business model of universities has become one that privileges big money successes that resemble those that have come before. Specifically in STEM, although in social sciences as well, which usually isn't included as part of STEM, the focus on high expense, quick payoff research incentivizes research that is low risk, right? And this is always been the case to some degree, but now as research has become ever more expensive with ever more technology and instrumentation, the more expensive your research, the more valuable you are to your university because, well, I'll get to why. This has invaded STEM in particular as a new orthodoxy. This is absolutely a new orthodoxy that has made universities and colleges less heterodox than they were, I would argue, in between 1950s and 1980s or so. And specifically, we have a cryptic move towards orthodoxy. In the United States, anyway, federal programs such as the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health provide the vast majority of funding for a tremendous amount of research, and indirect costs being what they are, which is to say that about 50% up to 80% of every single grant that is brought in by university researchers is taken as overhead, as indirect costs by the universities, and used not just for salaries for postdocs and for labs, but for libraries as well, and for HR and janitorial staff. It's the indirect costs from grants that are actually paying for the vast majority of universities, which means that all of us who don't do that high-tech, high instrumentation, high-expense research are benefiting from the indirect costs that are being brought in by these faculty. That means, though, that those faculty are valued more. They are valued more, they are sought after more, and the rest of us, be us in STEM or elsewhere, who tend to do lower expense research, are not listened to as much. We don't tend to have as much voice at the table, and I think it therefore it is no accident that, for instance, at least in the U.S., where these moves have been able to take hold most extremely are in the small liberal arts colleges where the science labs aren't as big and the scientists aren't bringing in as major grants. Because in the big universities, the scientists, the big science scientists, are being protected from the mobs. And unfortunately, they are also protected from knowing what the mobs are doing. So we have this slow but definitive creep toward big science. It's been happening for a while, but it's definitely happening now. Such research is rarely out of left field. It doesn't tend to surprise people. We think it surprises us. There's new proclamations every day, every week, every month about some new scientific result, but mostly these new scientific results are building on the foundation that has come before, rather than being paradigm shifts. It tends to fit in neat boxes and within the lines, and it tends to be orthodox, right? So specifically, I'm arguing that academic freedom fades in importance with a shift from hypothesis to data. We hear a lot now about data-driven science, about data being king. This is part of the problem. This is the orthodoxy speaking to us. In the 1500s, Francis Bacon first formalized the idea of what the scientific method was as a circular process in which observations generate ideas for what those observations mean, which we call hypotheses. And those hypotheses are then tested, and the results of the tests are the data. And later yet, statistics were often used to test those data, and then we end up with hopefully fewer hypotheses that haven't been falsified, that remain standing, and we go back and we observe more and we generate more hypotheses, and it goes around and around, and we end up with, when it works, an ever more refined understanding of what is true in the world. Hypothesis is the cornerstone of that method. Right now, we are in the era of big data. Data is what you always hear about. And data is the answer, not the question. We're starting with the answers and then pretending that we therefore knew what the questions were, and this is causing part of the problem. So theoretical work is being devalued. Greater focus is being placed on empirical work and on models, and we need both theory and empirical work. We need both. Pretending that one can exist without the other is forgetting what that research cycle is, that Francis Bacon identified 500 plus years ago, and leaving us, frankly, without science. This creates a culture that is less focused on big questions, on questions with no clear application, again, a return to the value of the liberal arts, and questions that have a long time horizon. When you have a grant cycle that wants you to be applying for more grants in 2 years, imagining that you can ask questions that you aren't going to have results on for 10 years is a very tough sell to administrators and granting agencies alike. So academic freedom fades under this cryptic orthodoxy because there are fewer people around to see and to say and to care. The scientists, the big scientists, are siloed in their own narrow domains, and so the grievance studies scholars, such as they are, can come in and fill the vacuum. There are fewer people around to say, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. That just doesn't make sense. And because there's less conversation happening across intellectual gaps, because scientists who actually know what a hypothesis is, and social scientists, and artists, and people from the humanities who think deeply about epistemology, for instance, rarely come together in rooms and actually discuss ideas. When we come together in rooms, more often, we're talking about the logistics of the business of running a college, right? Of course, our conversations are going to start to splinter, and into that vacuum comes some bad actors who then channel their information into activists, and there will always be some people in a group who are eager to run with it, and so that's what we've seen. I've mentioned paradigm shifts a couple of times, recognizing they're destructive of tradition, and so again, we have to hold in ourselves this tension between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, but that they are necessary for progress. So paradigm shifts, of course, were first named by Thomas Kuhn in his 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he was talking specifically about science, but I think it applies to most fields in which knowledge is being discovered as opposed to created, right? So in those fields where knowledge is being discovered to some degree, you can continue on in the way that you've been continuing on before with the models and the theoretical frameworks that you've had before, but what if you're wrong? It becomes ever harder to know that you're wrong if you are entrenched within a particular field. So, brick-in-the-wall science, in which you have a foundation on what you're building, and the work that you're doing is just one more brick in that wall, is orthodoxy. And it has value, and sometimes the orthodoxy is correct. But after years of brick-in-the-wall science, the practitioners, the scientists, don't value heterodoxy, because that would destroy their career. And they aren't prepared to see the revolution coming either. Scientists aren't speaking out right now against what is happening on college campuses, in part because they literally can't see it. They don't recognize it. They are busy doing their orthodoxy. So this tension, again, is the future will not look like the past. We need heterodox voices in order to make those leaps in wisdom that don't resemble the past, but we are building on that which has come before us. That's what's made us who we are. So tradition is important and necessary, but orthodoxy, absent heterodoxy, precludes the generation of new wisdom. How do we get there? So before I get to a few remedies, let me just make one case in point. Our understanding of the origins of humanity's greatest innovations, including, among other things, writing, astronomy, architecture, and city-states, has changed radically in the last several decades. 30 years ago or so, Mesopotamia was understood to be the cradle of civilization, the place where commerce and city-states first emerged. And over time, we had a greater understanding that, oh, actually, maybe the Sumerians borrowed from the Egyptians, and maybe the Indians as well, and with the Chinese, a totally independent evolution of all of these concepts, probably. And certainly in Mesoamerica, as for the Maya, the Aztec, and in South America, the Inca, and throughout the Americas, that's not borrowing what happened there. That is a totally separate evolution of writing, of astronomy, of architecture, of city-states. And we know this now. We know this for sure. There's lots that we don't know, and I'm sure we're wrong about some of what we think we know. But the fact of there being multiple independent evolutions of many of the greatest innovations that humans have ever come up with should give us hope. We're extraordinary, right? Humans are actually capable of great things, and there was a Mayan Enlightenment, and it's mostly lost because almost all of their writing was destroyed. But the fact that we don't know it doesn't make it any less true. It still happened. History happened, whether or not we're aware of it in all of its details or not. So I would say at university we have the opportunity to teach students how to understand the claims that I just made, how to assess them, and how to make meaning of them. Let's see. Different minds are going to gravitate to different parts of this story. Some people may be interested in dating artifacts to figure out when the linear history happened. Some people will be interested in deciphering ancient scripts. Others will be focused on the meaning of the arts, the textiles, the roads, the concept of zero, any number of things. But whatever your way in, coming to understand the messy, chaotic, beautifully wise, and ever-growing more wise with dips in the near term wisdom of humanity is part of what education is for, part of what we should be doing. So we were asked to make some recommendations for right now, and I will, for administrators, for students, and for faculty all. But first, some caveats. First, it might be too late. It might be. We collectively in higher ed have been ignoring critique in the era of Sokol in the 90s and now Grievance Studies Project right now, last year, for so long as this new orthodoxy has been spreading and allowed to take over sciences that it's really quite a mess out there. So let's hope it's not too late. The problem, of course, is larger than higher ed, and we can point to faculty in disciplines that don't feel real to most of us emerging with these ideas, but of course it's spread through boardrooms and cubicles throughout most of the Western world at this point. And individuals doing the right thing can't solve the problem. A single person standing up and saying, I object, is not going to win against the mob. Game theory tells us this, unless you have other people standing up with you very quickly, and that's part of what this room is about, or you have an institution that has your back. So either way, you need backup, you need support. Right? So, remedies for the administration. One thing I would say for the administration of any college is that in this era of loyalty oaths, which come in the form of diversity statements and anti-bias training and such, and they are effectively loyalty oaths, stop that. Don't do that anymore. We ought heed, in fact, the words of 19th century University President James B. Angell, who is credited with transforming the University of Michigan to the elite public institution that it is today. In his inaugural speech in 1871, I think, yes, he argued that an institution should never insist on the faculty pronouncing the shibboleths of sect or party. We ought heed those words well now. Other things administrators should do is hire upper administration who aren't from schools of ed, That's captured, at least in the US. The schools of ed are gone, or from grievance studies. This ought to go without saying, but obviously if you hire people from exactly the disciplines that use circular reasoning and can't take in new information that they don't agree with, you're going to have a problem. Hiring practices for admin and for faculty also should represent evolutionarily stable strategies, not singular strategies where we know we're hiring for X, but ones which allow for multiple views in either a faculty field or administration. We should be shrinking rather than growing admin, which is exactly the opposite of the trend that is happening now. And that in turn would leave more money for, say, research and students. And we should hire and promote faculty based on broader criteria, and certainly without prioritizing the amount of grant money that they're bringing in. And it's impossible to do that with the current business model. But that is a big part of what has promoted the orthodoxy over in STEM. So for students, here again on this is the Ecuadorian Amazon with some of our students and my son, and me looking up at a Waorani woman who was climbing this tree, demonstrating to us one of the traditional methods by which fruit is obtained from trees in the Amazon. And from a hat making factory in the Andes to tree climbing in the Ecuadorian Amazon, this represents, this I think is what education should be. And I know it is what it can be. And these students are terrific, as many are. But I will say that many of the students that we have showing up now of traditional age are broken in a way that they weren't 20 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And some of that just isn't their fault. So I will push back a little bit on what Eric said and say, actually, we have societally broken some students such that through a combination of helicopter and snowplow parenting, they've never had challenge, so of course they don't know what to do with it when it comes. Through big pharma, the number of students who are on mood disruptors and sex hormones and growth hormones that come in exogenously through pills, they don't know how to be. They haven't had a normal development. And let's see, they've had more times with screens than with humans, many of them. And of course, humans give you reflection back on how you're doing. And they can read mood and they can have conversation. And we also now know that what many of those screens are doing is using algorithms to addict us. Interaction with humans is also addictive, and it's a better addiction to have. So given that we actually owe these students maybe an apology, but also our sympathy for having produced a whole generation that is less capable of dealing with conflict than people who have come before, what should they be doing? Every college student on graduation should be able to demonstrate that they have a skill in something that required physical feedback from the universe, not just social feedback. So what I mean by that is you can fool a professor, and a professor can fool you, but you can't fool a tree or a tractor, a circuit, or a surfboard. This woman, who you can't see because she's off screen, did in fact climb this tree. And afterwards, many of us tried too, and some of us failed, and some of us succeeded. And you couldn't argue afterwards if you failed, well, I kind of got up enough, and it was fine. No, you either got up a certain amount or you didn't. You either learned the skill in place or you didn't. And having at least one skill that can't be gamed by social manipulation is absolutely critical. Also, I would say for students, be prepared to be uncomfortable and surprised. Never accept, we don't ask those questions here, with the understanding that there are going to be some ugly questions and some ugly answers, and that human history is a long series of genocides and rapes and takeovers, both brutal and subtle, and that is true. That is true, but knowing it and understanding why is a better response than to hide our heads in the ground. And if we simply try to confirm our pre-existing biases, well, okay, if our pre-existing biases are accurate, confirmation of true things, it's okay. It's a waste of time, but it's okay. Confirmation of false things, of course, leads to a fantasy world, and that's where a lot of people are now living. For faculty, we gotta level up. Faculty have got to level up. So the concept of the Overton window is that intellectual space for some group of ideas or some discipline outside of which conversation is not tolerated. Most of us, most of the time, live firmly within the Overton window for societal expectations, for our own disciplines. But every faculty, regardless of whether they live firmly within their own tradition, firmly within their Overton window, need to at least know what the boundaries are, and sometimes at least stand outside from the perspective of this photograph, stand outside the Overton window and see what it feels like, and get a sense of what that perspective is. And related to this, I would say that all faculty should, if they at all possibly can be at least multidisciplinary. Best if you could be a generalist, but most research doesn't really allow for generalism. We certainly need some generalists who tend to be the more heterodox thinkers, and the specialists are more likely to be orthodox because they're trained very narrowly. But if you can be multidisciplinary, it at least allows you to see from multiple perspectives, different methods, different ways of approaching questions, and that will give you some insight. Also for faculty, we should be engaging with the naive undergraduates. Many faculty have imagined that dumb or subtle questions just aren't worth their time. And in fact, most faculty, especially over time, especially as we become more advanced in our careers, try to insulate ourselves from the undergrads. Bob Trivers, who was perhaps the greatest living evolutionary biologist and who was my and Bret's undergraduate advisor, said to us when we were still college students, he said, "Do not take a job, an academic job, at a place where you won't be teaching undergraduates." Why? Why, Bob? Because they don't yet know the questions they're not supposed to ask. We should all be exposed to the questions we're not supposed to ask. And so, okay, you're in a classroom with undergraduates, and they're asking questions, and you're feeling like, but I have things to get to, I have content I need to deliver, how am I going to get through this? Think about it this way. Sometimes the field is right, and the answer is simple, and you can address it, move on. It's not that hard, okay? Sometimes your field, when you get asked a question by a student and they don't know the answer, sometimes your field is right, but the answer is complex or nuanced or subtle, and it's been a while since you really thought about it, back since you were at the beginning of your career yourself. And figuring out or remembering how to explain what those nuances are, what that subtlety is, what that complexity is certainly worth the time of any thinker who deserves the title. And maybe most valuable of all, sometimes the field's wrong, right? Sometimes the orthodoxy needs changing, and the answer is not understood, but it takes a naive view of the matter to have positioned themselves such that they could ask the question. So, in conclusion, I want to remind us of the usefulness of useless knowledge, which is the title of an article by Abraham Flexner, who was the founder of Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study. He wrote in 1939, at a time of great chaos in the world, in this essay, The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge, the following. Universities have been so reorganized that they have become tools of those who believe in a special political, economic, or racial creed. Now and then a thoughtless individual in one of the few democracies left in this world will even question the fundamental importance of absolutely untrammeled academic freedom. The real enemy of the human race is not the fearless and irresponsible thinker, be he right or wrong. The real enemy is the man who tries to mold the human spirit so that it will not dare to spread its wings. Thank you.